The true nature of man is to become a beautiful soul, as Friedrich Schiller discusses this. And the only person who can fulfill that condition is the genius. So says Helga Zepp-LaRouche in her 10 Principles for a New Strategic and Development Architecture. As the doomed transatlantic state elites self-destruct at an ever-accelerating rate, nations around the world are rejecting their rule of lawlessness.
And I think the big story of the WEF of Davos this year is that it's sliding into absurdity and irrelevance, that it's fading.
Russia's deputy chairman of the Security Council and former president, Dmitry Medvedev, also commented on the Davos World Economic Forum. What a shameful situation, to say the least. The Davos Forum is discussing tank supplies to Ukraine. People used to discuss other things in Davos, like the economy. The good thing is that there are neither Russian nor Chinese businessmen there. It was noted that even financier George Soros was conspicuously absent from this year's Davos conference, and many wondered why. Many of the participants themselves seemed perplexed as to why they were even there and what the thrust of their imperial policy pronouncements should be. For example, the London Economist embarrassed European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen by publishing a cover story some days after her Davos speech, extolling the success of the Anglosphere sanctions policy against Russia, which, according to von der Leyen, had left the Russian economy facing a decade of regression. On the contrary, the Economist headline read, "In 2022, Russia kept the economic show on the road." It is sometimes said that the last stage of decadence is senility. Though the trappings of wealth and power may persist, they cannot hide the transience and fragility of the momentary dominance of history by monstrous buffoons. Though they have the power to wage war, ultimately, destruction and force can never win the hearts of people to any regime for any length of time. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, and now with Ukraine, we are seeing not the global consolidation of an empire, but the self-immolation of a once great civilization, like that depicted in painter Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire. The danger has become so great that Russia's ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, has asked the American people the following question. Washington is completely deaf to our signals. I would like to ask the American people a long overdue question. What else should Russia say or do to make the hotheads in the administration come to their senses and avert the nuclear Armageddon that the White House publicly is so keen to prevent? Happily, as Martin Luther King said, man's hankering for the demonic is always disturbed by his longing for the divine. A great vision can create a great solution with which no tyranny of force can compete. Can the world respond to the call initiated by Pope Francis and supported by Helga Zepp-LaRouche and others for a higher process of dialogue and resolution of war without preconditions? Collaborations among nations like that of the Belt and Road Initiative or the alliance among Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, and other nations known as the BRICS Plus show us that economic development is truly the new name for peace. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for an international Schiller Institute conference for February 4th. The theme for that conference is An Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. In her conference presentation, Zepp-LaRouche wrote, "At this point, the trust between the West and Russia and China is at an historic low point. Therefore, a great vision is required on how a solution can be put on the table, which addresses all the major problems together, such as a new, just world economic order based on such concepts as the Global Security Initiative in combination with the Global Development Initiative. I think that we have reached a point in the history of mankind where we really must get serious about the international order of relations among nations and how we can organize them in such a way that we can self-govern as a species, which is gifted with creative reason. In contrast to that outlook, the transatlantic policy of sanctions, war, and division would depopulate the planet either sooner in the form of thermonuclear war or later in the form of an ecological catastrophe brought on not by fossil fuels, but by the lack of development of nuclear power, particularly thermonuclear fusion and other advanced energy-dense technologies capable of sustaining even tens of billions of people. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's reference this past week to the golden billion depopulation scheme, that only 1 billion of the 8 billion people presently on the planet really matter, makes clear that the policies of NATO are increasingly inhuman and reminiscent of 1930s universal fascism. The signing of the joint declaration on European Union NATO cooperation on January 10th was the high point of this process, something that has been in the making for several years. It states explicitly that the alliance and the EU's goal is to use all political, economic, and military means in the interests of the golden billion. This is exactly what it says. In the interests of the 1 billion residents of NATO and the EU countries. The rest of the world, to quote High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell, is a jungle that stifles progress in the garden and must therefore be reformatted. Whether we will have an age of reason or the annihilation of humanity is up to us and to what we dare to achieve. Principle 4 of the Zepp-LaRouche 10 Principles states, since mankind is the only creative species known so far in the universe, and given the fact that human creativity is the only source of wealth through the potentially limitless discovery of new physical principles, one of the main aims of the new international security and development architecture must be providing access to universal education for every child and adult person living. The true nature of man is to become a beautiful soul, as Friedrich Schiller discusses this. And the only person who can fulfill that condition is the genius. Helga Zepp-LaRouche discussed the international situation with Harley Schlanger earlier this week.
Now, talking about global NATO, there were some developments in the last couple of days. There was a publication of an article by Evan Ellis, who's from the U.S. Army War College. The article titled Strategic Role of Latin America in Global Conflict over Taiwan. And this includes the idea that Latin America should be a resource base for the United States to loot, and the threat of China Belt and Road development there is a threat against the United States. This is pretty blatant, isn't it? I mean, this is the new face of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, this article was published in a magazine of the Peruvian army, and therefore maybe this Evans Ellis thought that, it's for a limited audience. But this article is actually quite revealing, because he says, that there will be war with China latest by 2027 over Taiwan, and that war will be global, and therefore the countries of Latin America have no right to ally with the Belt and Road Initiative, because this would give China access to resources in Latin America. Now, first of all, to say this, that there will be war with China by 2027, and this war will be global, and obviously planning for that war and preparing for that war, I think that's just insane. It's insane. Who wants to plan for World War III and then think anybody will survive it? So if you thought that this was just a statement of some low-level guy from the War College, well, now the head of the U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, basically said the same thing, and even being more specific, saying Latin America has all these raw materials. They have 60% of the world's lithium. They have rare earth. They have, other crucial minerals and raw materials. And therefore, Latin America can absolutely not be allowed to make deals with the adversary, meaning Russia and China, because she says this is a total confrontation, including the whole gambit, air, sea, cyber, space. I mean, in a sense, yeah. And she says also that China would only make these infrastructure projects with countries in Latin America to lure them into the debt trap. Now, this is, I think, if people start to believe their own propaganda, it's really becoming bad. 150 countries of the developing sector are very happy to work with the Belt and Road Initiative because it gives them the first time the chance to have real infrastructure projects to overcome poverty, to have a hope to overcome the underdevelopment. And as for the debt trap, I think if you look at the record of which country is indebted with whom, you find that the majority of debt is going to banks of the Paris Club, to the IMF and the World Bank, and to the West, and that it is not China at all. So, obviously, with the election of the Lula government in Brazil, you have now the overwhelming majority of countries in Latin America who are, determined to cooperate with China in the formation of a new world economic order. But, you have at the same time massive destabilizations going on in many countries, Brazil being the most violent so far, and Peru naturally. So, I think it's really amazing what is going on.
Well, her comments, she also said, we are not in competition, we are in conflict. And she said, we're not going to allow this to occur in our neighborhood. Doesn't that remind you of what Brzezinski said about no Japan south of our border?
Yeah, and it also reminds me of the famous or infamous Kissinger NSM 200 memorandum from 1974, which was only published somewhere in the 90s, which is, where he said very blatantly that all the raw materials of the world belong to the United States or are of US national security interest. This is definitely not going to go unnoticed because, what you have right now, let me just add this concerning this global NATO. You have right now a very clear effort to put together one military alliance after the other to create a network of, corresponding military agreements. For example, between the EU and NATO, there was just made an agreement that they basically want to merge in such a way that each member of the one group is automatically in contact with all other groups. Now, if you then add to the fact that you have the Japan UK reciprocal access agreement between Japan and Great Britain, they have now basically, they can use each other's territory and forces in a reciprocal way. Then you have the AUKUS, that's the US, Australia, British military alliance, which China is clearly the target of. And so you have basically, then you have an effort by Japan. Japan is now, with Kishida's visit in the United States, basically going back to its military past, which is really, one has to look at that. Germany is going back to its military past. And if people talk about, putting the German industry back on a war economy, well, doesn't that bring forward very eerie memories of 80 years ago? If Japan is now basically talking about nuclear weapons and doubling its military budget, and Kishida also said that, Japan is going to seek actively a role in military alliances with countries in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, obviously courting India very heavily, with an India-Japan strategic partnership. So you can actually see that there is a real effort to cement this global NATO in an alliance against Russia, China, and the countries of the global south who want to go in the direction of a new world economic order. And that's really the fight, what all of this is all about. You have some people who want to keep the status quo, which makes the billionaires happy, but keeps the billions of people in relative poverty. And then you have an effort by those countries who want to overcome colonialism because, they have recognized that colonialism did continue to exist in modern clothes, basically by monetary and trade agreements, which puts them in a status of inferiority, and they want to end that. So, that is really the essence of the conflict, and it has very little to do with what the mainstream media are telling anybody, because, Ukraine is just the battleground for the containment of Russia, which is now linked to China. So you can't look at Ukraine in an isolated fashion. You have to look at this totality of the process which is going on. And this has the potential of disaster, which is why we are calling for a complete shift in the policy, and that you have to go back to negotiation and find solutions by diplomacy, because if you continue on this road of militarizing the whole world, well, what's at stake is really the existence of humanity.
I got on a little late, but I was able to listen to the discussion, and it actually prompted me to go back to a slug that was written, I think it was last week's briefing, and it contained, actually, it was a segment of a discussion that Lynn had with the intelligence sector in 1995. And the subject of it was, how do you do intelligence, right? And I think it relates a lot with this idea with the coincidence of opposites. And I'll just, read it quickly. It's not too much. But he actually said that all intelligence work is premised on the method of Plato, that is, the method of change, epitomized by the problem posed in the Parmenides dialogue. You are searching for something which has no name. No name you're going to put in the computer defines it. All intelligence is created work in the sense of the one-many relationship described by Plato in the Parmenides dialogue. You're going to discover a one whose name you do not know, and therefore you can never put the name in the computer. How do you define an incommensurable? You take at least two or more values which are not the incommensurable, and you try to box in the area where the incommensurable lives, which consists of everything you know about the area defined. The area among a set of values, not on a set of values. You cannot triangulate the precise position of the value you're looking for. If you can, you're doing the wrong thing. You must define an area of knowledge in which you are going to search to define the existence of what you're looking for in terms of the conditions in the area of knowledge put under scrutiny. So what you're actually doing is you're creating a many from everything you have available. plus what you can think of. You're looking at that many, and you're trying to solve the one-many problem. That is intelligence work. And I just wanted your thoughts on that, Jerry, because I think it relates a lot.
Yeah.
It relates a lot. Yeah. It's
true. It's true.
Of the coincidence of opposites, and what you were saying about getting above what's posed, what's posed in terms of the battlefield if they're going to win it there, but you need to go to a higher negotiating platform, a higher hypothesis. And I think that's what he's challenging his people on when he's discussing intelligence work. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and he always did that. Yeah. You see, the more you understand the one as you work on it, Kuza is the best in history on that question. Okay? The more capable you are of getting at the truth. And the way you will order it. You see, the mind measures and harmonizes. That's what the mind does. It measures, it harmonizes, and discovers new measure and new harmony. Because the universe itself is evolving. So you can look, and that's why I was so excited when Helga put the 10 principles. Dennis will tell you, I called him and he said, look, I want to do a 3-part series on this, right? Because she had generated a unique discovery of something she was working at for 2 to 3 years. And it just clicked. And that was, you know what I mean? And that's an example of the discovery of the higher process. And if you look at it, it's not a program. It's a set of epistemological insights which ends with man is good. This is a big fight in civilization. Because a lot of these fundamentalist religions said man is irredeemably evil, and they really mean it. I mean, they're not just saying that, and that by grace of God, some unique principle. So that's, I think, a tremendous example of the kind of breakthroughs that you can make. But like Dennis said, I thought that was very poetic and very beautiful. Helga has mankind in her gut. What does mankind need? Lynn said that all. What does mankind need of me? And that's what I must do. So yeah, I think that's a very useful, putting that in is very useful.
Yeah, that idea also about the mind being measurement. I mean, that's what the word means in the NS, it's a Latin word. The same word is for measure. That's exactly the idea. Mind is a measurement.
Your policy.
Okay.
We are on the brink of nuclear war with Russia.
Yes.
You have authorized sending $100 billion to a Nazi, and you refused to debate me. And I got 66,000 signatures to get on the ballot.
Okay.
And you refused to meet with me, although your funding has put my name on a Ukrainian kill list. And neither you nor Senator Kirsten Gillibrand responded to your constituents, myself and Scott Ritter, and your colleague, Senator Rand Paul, is on that list as well.
Thank you. Publisher Fred Gabriel, editor-in-chief Corey Shelton.
fascist dictatorship in Ukraine.
To help foster it.
That is our hope, that when Americans realize that the situation is actually far worse than you think it is, you may dig deep and find the fortitude to actually take the measures that are required, but that has to be done quickly. Now, I wanted to start my remarks with a quote from a great American genius who was born in 1880 and who happens to also be a descendant of the revolutionary governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood. This person writes, "It is very interesting to watch a plant grow. It is like taking part in creation. When all outside is cold and white, when the little children of the woodland are gone to their nurseries in the warm earth, and the empty nests on the bare trees fill with snow, my window garden glows and smiles, making summer within while it is winter without. It is wonderful to see flowers in bloom in the midst of a snowstorm. I have felt a bud shyly doff her green hood and blossom with a silken burst of sound," unquote, while the icy fingers of the snow beat against the window panes. What secret power, I wonder, caused this blossoming miracle? What mysterious force guided the seedling from dark earth up to the light, through leaf and stem and bud, to glorious fulfillment in the perfect flower? Who could have dreamed that such beauty lurked in dark earth, was latent in the tiny seeds we planted? Beautiful flower, you have taught me to see a little way into the hidden heart of things. Now I understand that darkness everywhere may hold possibilities better even than my hopes." That was written by Helen Keller, who was both deaf and blind and never saw what she was writing about physically, but clearly understood it better than most people alive today. And I'm starting with that because for us to succeed in what appears to be mission impossible, we are going to have to become profound thinkers, able to discern universal principles from less significant facts, little turds of so-called information, and the multitude of outright lies which surround us in our oh-so-civilized Western society, which has taken upon itself to make the rules of the world, which shouldn't even be called rules because that implies a measure or standard, and there is none. There is only the whim of the powerful or the seemingly powerful, and that's what we're going to discover. We can also study the life and education of Helen Keller to gain an insight into how very lazy and dumbed down we've become, how we've been willfully robbed of the right to develop our minds, and how the children of the United States are being made into mentally ill terrorists. Helen writes of her preliminary exam for Radcliffe, which she took in 1897. That means she was 17 years old. And remember, if the texts were not in Braille, someone would have to spell every word into her hand, and she would type her answers on a typewriter, and someone would have to spell it back into her hand so she could edit it. And she writes this, quote, "The subjects were elementary and advanced German, French, Latin, English, and Greek and Roman history, making 9 hours in all. I passed in everything and received honors in German and English. How many 17-year-olds do you know who can both see and hear who could not pass such an exam? How many of us who are a little bit older than 17 could pass such an exam today? George Washington, in his 1796 farewell address, warned about the urgent need for universal education in a republic where the people have as much power as we do. We still have that much power, but our spiritual eyes have been gouged out as cruelly as Gloucester's eyeballs were torn from their sockets in Shakespeare's King Lear. Therefore, we don't see the things that are right in front of us. Take the terrorist attack already mentioned by Colonel Black on the Nord Stream pipelines in September. Wasn't that a criminal act? The willful destruction of an $11 billion project, which was going to supply heat and energy to millions of Europeans? Did anyone refute the text message sent from the very short-termed British Prime Minister, who had told us that she could easily push the nuclear button without qualms because it was her job, Liz Truss, to the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken? It is done. Just as Hillary Clinton's emails revealing her intent to steal the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination from Bernie Sanders were never refuted, neither was the Liz Truss text message. So we have it before the eyes of the world that minimally the United States and Great Britain committed one of the most costly acts of infrastructure terrorism in history, and no one is even indicted, much less jailed, and they are free to continue their evil objective to destroy Russia at the risk of thermonuclear war, and then move on to attempt to destroy China as well. But here in the United States, the land of the free, we have a few dozen people being tortured in solitary confinement in DC jails for going to the Capitol on January 6th to ask for redress from their government for what appeared to have been a stolen election. We have Julian Assange languishing in Belmarsh prison for merely reporting what others told him, with the self-professed liar and thief Mike Pompeo discussing his assassination, and perhaps now running as a credible candidate for US president. And we have the case of Lyndon LaRouche, whose name to this day is even more explosive than that of Donald Trump. The electric third rail, as Jimmy Dore put it, because of the decades-long attempt to silence him through slander, incarceration, and even attempted assassination. How did we get here? We got here because we have been cowards for many generations. Lyndon LaRouche described the phenomenon as he saw it returning home from World War II. Millions of Americans had served the cause of justice and freedom courageously in combat. Hundreds of thousands gave their lives. The 4 years of war had required much sacrifice on the home front, not nearly what was suffered by the Soviet Union, I might add, which suffered 27 million lives lost and total destruction of hundreds of cities and towns. But it had been a sacrifice for the Americans as well. So when the soldiers returned, they and their families agreed to make up for lost time, hence the baby boom. And once you have a family, you've got to keep your nose clean. Don't get involved in anything which could cause you to lose your job or worse. So people largely were silent through the McCarthyite witch hunts and J. Edgar Hoover's weaponization of the FBI. People went along with the lie that the nuclear bombing of Japan was necessary even though it was 2 civilian population centers. Yes, it's horrible, but let's just not think about it. It saved millions of lives. But we still had some fighters, largely military veterans, and some people in the Congress, like our old friend Neil Gallagher, who themselves got smeared, indicted, and jailed. We had President Eisenhower, who pushed back and who warned about the military-industrial complex. But we didn't have anyone effectively speaking about the Nazis being brought into our intelligence agencies, for example. No one was able to prevent everything that FDR intended for the post-war world from being overthrown. His son, Elliot Roosevelt, wrote a whole book about his travels with his father during World War II as a witness to President Franklin Roosevelt's plans to liberate every single colony, to green the deserts of Africa, and to eradicate poverty worldwide by giving nations an equal voice through several institutions, including the United Nations. Then in 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy won the election. And while she had initially opposed him, Eleanor Roosevelt became an important friend of his. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been fired by Truman, advised Kennedy against being involved in a land war in Asia. And we can surmise that he probably had much more to say in private, including MacArthur's own strongly held view, correct view, that with the advent of the nuclear bomb, war had become impossible, and that mankind had to have a spiritual recrudescence and devise a better way of resolving disputes. Now, let's remember what Kennedy said at his inaugural address. This is just an excerpt.
Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. But neither can 2 great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations. Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation, may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved. All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin. In your hands, my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course. Since this country was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, North and South, East and West, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
The general welfare means exactly what it means in 1 Corinthians 13, when Paul writes of agape. or is sometimes called love or charity. Is that quality. That it is not the law, it is not the rule book that counts. It's your love of humanity that counts. That you must always live for your love of humanity. And therefore, government is not legitimate, except as government is officially committed to the general welfare of not only all of the people, but also the improvement of the condition of life of their posterity. And for the first time in France, with that state, the principle of constitutional law that government cannot treat some of the people as human cattle. It is not legitimate. It is not a nation if it treats some of his people as human cattle. It must think of the general welfare of all of the people. It must be captured by a sense of responsibility to all of the people and to their posterity. Because we are all mortal. And to arouse in us the passions while we're alive, which will impel us to do good, we have to have a sense that our life and the consuming of our life, the spending of our talent, is going to mean something for coming generations. The best people look for things that, like Moses, that are going to happen when he will no longer be around to enjoy them. It's this sense of immortality. It's why parents in the best degree sacrifice for their children. It's why communities sacrifice for education for their children, for opportunities for their children. You go the pangs of suffering and shortage, but you have a sense that you're going someplace, that your life is going to mean something, that you can die with a smile on your face. You've conquered death. Your life, you've spent your talent wisely. Why life will mean something better for generations to come. That was the principle. That principle inspired the plan of King Henry VII of England to do the same thing against the evil Richard III and established England at that time as the second modern nation state. In a sense, that's what Martin was doing, the same kind of process. But now let's take the other side of the thing. Let's take the case of Hamlet. Hamlet says that we have the opportunity to fight to free ourselves from horrible conditions, but what happens after we die? What happens beyond death? And it is the fear of what happens beyond death which makes people cowards. And that is our problem in the United States today. It's a problem of our leadership in the Democratic Party, it's the problem in the Republican Party, because not all Republicans are bad. Some of them are very good. I intend to incorporate some of them in my government. I'm not very partisan when it comes to government. I'm partisan about getting it established. So that's the point. The problem here is this. We actually believe that man is different than an animal. Do you think in the schools today, in the newspapers today, do you think that Americans believe in any significant way that man is different than an animal? Our teaching, we don't teach that. Look at our standard curriculum. Many of you know something about education. What our education policies now nationally are a crime. You don't know anything, you learn to pass a test. And if one of the person who designs the test knows what they're talking about. Yeah. You have tests are issued in various parts of the country, not to test what you've done to the students in terms of what they know. Sometimes the students come out saying, I know nothing. Honor students say, in my years in secondary school, I learned nothing. The way it's being taught now under the standard now. What they're testing is the obedience training of the students in that school district or that part of the country as measured by some standard. Districts are competing for money. And the performance, like the dog training of the students in the school, becomes a standard at for how much money and how many honors that district will get in the following year. We're no longer concerned. We don't believe as a nation. We don't believe in developing people. We have become like Rome, ancient Rome, a society of bread and circuses. Get your crumbs and be entertained. And the entertainment gets more and more vicious as it goes along. For example, today, do people work? Is their mentality one of working? Do they believe in work? Do they believe the society gives them the opportunity to work? No. It doesn't. It gives them the opportunity to get some money. What is the biggest growth industry in the United States? Gambling. What is Wall Street? Gambling. What is Enron? Gambling. What are these guys that are going to jail in New York? Gamblers. The mentality of the country is that if you're getting lucky and winning the lottery and winning at the track, that you're getting ahead. Even though your industry is collapsing, your farm is gone, the city government can no longer afford to take care of your essential needs, we've gone into become a gambling society. We rely on what? Mass entertainment. What kind of mass entertainment? Is this something you really should be ashamed of? We no longer regard human beings as human. We no longer understand what is human. I've started a youth movement some 4 years ago. It concentrates on young people 18 to 25 years of age. That is the university age group. And as you know, people, when they get to about 18 to 25 under normal conditions, have passed over from thinking of themselves as adolescents, as being half adults, half children, into becoming, in a sense, adults. They have adult confidence, adult impulses, and so forth. They are ready to assume responsibility in society. In a well-ordered society, everyone would have a quality type of university education accessible to them. So in order to develop the talent of each person to find out what their mission in life should be, what kind of career they should adopt, and to give them the opportunity to work through fighting that out and finding out who they really are as an adult and choosing their profession in future life on that basis. In that kind of, what I emphasize in the training is understand the difference between man and the beast. Now, I'm going to get a little bit technical at this point, but it's an important point. What is the difference between man and beast? Can you prove that man is not just an animal? And how can you prove it? If man were an ape, for example, the population of human beings on this planet would never have exceeded several million individuals. So don't make a monkey out of man. We have now over 6 billion people on this planet to take care of, and they're growing. The point is that man has been able to discover what no animal can do, to discover universal physical principles of the universe, to apply these discovered principles to make improvements in society, which increases man's power over nature. Just as you can read in Genesis 1. Man and woman made equally in the image of the Creator, in the likeness of the Creator, and responsible for this function. That's what we are. When we teach physical science, when we teach classical art and things like that, when we teach history from that standpoint, we are actually imparting to young people a sense of their humanity. They are capable of reenacting the great discoveries of principle from the past, whether in art or whether in physical science. When they know that, they know the difference between themselves and the beast. They pride themselves on this. And they say, we're human. And they can look at each other with love, a kind of love which is expressed in education by the proper kind of class, in which students share in the process of fighting through the act of discovering for themselves a principle presented to them as a challenge and a paradox. I mean, there's a loving relationship, a class of size of 15 to 25, typical good university, good secondary school class, in which the students are given the responsibility, given a challenge to try to fight it through among themselves. And the good teacher tries to evoke this kind of response from among the students, find 2 or 3 in the class that'll start the discussion, and try to get the entire class involved in the discussion. So that what comes out of that is not memorizing something in a textbook. What comes out of that is the process of a social experience of discovering the meaning of a principle as if they had made the original discovery themselves. This is done not by teaching the individual student, though that sometimes works. It's done by getting the students to interact in the process of discussion. That's why you want a class size of between 15 and 25. Not too many to exclude the opportunity for people to participate. Not too few so you don't get the stimulation of starting the discussion. But it's this social process of relationship among people who love each other in a higher sense because they have shared the process of discovery of a principle, or they've understood something about history, but they've shared it. And the idea of sharing human knowledge as human knowledge is the essential act of loving. And you love mankind and you're happy with mankind when you have worked together to make a discovery together with people. And you realize you can rely on those people for that kind of method. You got a problem with them? Well, go back to the method. Talk to them the same way you do in the classroom. Fight it out with them. And these young people are fun. They fight it out till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I usually, when I give a lecture with these guys, they go at me for about 4 hours. I give them about 1 hour presentation or something like that. And they're at me all over the place. But it's beautiful, it's wonderful.
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve, or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture. For the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal, more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise. Then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements. It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who, at the moment, was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole company, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grey cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died, each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.